Welcome to Unit 4, Part 5, Worms, Lophophores, and Mollusks. Let's get started. So, let's talk about worms at first. We've got nematodes. Nematodes are typically very small, round worms. Many of them are parasites, but they don't have to be. There are terrestrial examples as well, but we're not going to get into those. Some of them affect even plants. So, but we're going to talk about the marine ones now. Mostly small, like I said, slender, cylindrical body, pointed ends, okay, at both ends. So remember, we're getting more advanced here. We're going into the next level of evolutionary complexity, right? So these organisms have something called a hydrostatic skeleton, a layer of muscles. Muscles. Before, sea stars, the phylum Echinodermata, right? They moved not with muscles, but with a WVS, a water vascular system that pumped water through their tubes, to move. But now we're talking about a muscular system. So aids in locomotion. Segmented worms, we're moving on to more complex. So these are also called the annelids. Earthworms are an example, but we're going to focus on marine worms, okay? So series of repeated compartments, segmented. And they always have similar body shapes like this. The gut, the coelom, we learned that last unit, or last section of the unit, lies in a cavity called the coelom. Just like the cnidarians, they have a digestive tract, and usually what, it comes in here, goes out the other end. Polychaetes are the first example of that. Polychaetes are classed Polychaeta. Each segment has this pair of flattened extensions that they use that look like this, called parapodia. Para means almost, and podia means foot, so these like almost like feet, okay? And they use them for locomotion. Here is an up-close view of a polychaete worm, segmented polychaete worm. You can see the parapodia sticking out all along each segment. Stiff, sharp bristles. This is a bloodworm on a mudflat. They're also called sandworms. The bristles are called setae. And they're very good bait, actually, for fishing for flounders. We used to fish with them in New York all the time. Here's an up-close version of like their head. They have these little feelers called tenticular cirri. They have eyes or eye spots, so they're not very complex eyes, but they can detect light, for example. Light sensor, nuchal organ, and parapodium. Parapodia. Polychaetes have a closed circulatory system. Again, higher level of organization, higher level, more advanced systems with blood vessels. That's why the bloodworm is called a bloodworm. When you cut it, it actually bleeds red blood everywhere. They also have spiky, biting mouth parts, and they'll draw blood from you too. They have gills to extract oxygen from the water. So again, more advanced, right? Okay, and they are extensions of the body wall that have many thin-walled blood vessels called capillaries. And capillary walls are so thin that the gas exchange can go right through the tissue, from the external to the internal. And this is one from South Carolina. There are about 6,000 species. Many of them are carnivores, like that bloodworm I talked to you about. This is called a lugworm. This is a deposit feeder, so it's not a carnivore. It will eat organic particles that settle to the bottom. So it's sort of like a detritive worm, if you will. Deposit feeder. They're feeding on the stuff that gets deposited. Deposition, weathering, erosion, deposition, deposited. At the bottom, all that organic marine snow and stuff that goes at the bottom, they're feeding on that. Bottom feeders, but we don't typically use that term in science. Many of them live in tubes made of mucus, protein, bits of seaweed, cemented mud particles, or sand grains, or even tiny fragments of shells. And if you're at the beach and you just swim out right past where the waves are breaking and go down, dive down 4 or 5 feet, whatever it might be, with a mask on, you can find worms of these kinds all over the place. This is a feather duster worm. They're very popular in marine aquaria. Pacific Ocean tube worms. So some of them could look like this. This is all made from tube worms that glued together tiny pieces of clay or mud to make this. This one also, all made from tube worms. See the tubes here? And even shells like this are made by worms. Okay. Other worms, we have peanut worms. They live in muddy bottoms, they hide in shells, or burrow into rocks and corals. The mouth contains branching tentacles, like this, that can be withdrawn, causing the worm to become compacted. That looks just like a peanut. That's why they get their name, peanut worm. Spoon worms, 100 species of these guys. They're really strange looking. All of them are marine. You're very rarely ever going to see one of these unless you're digging out in the mud flats or digging at a sandbar, maybe even. And they can make these huge tunnels. They have these tunnels deep underground. This is called an innkeeper worm. They're pretty amazing, but you probably never going to see these unless you are out there actually looking for them. Beard worms, long, thin worms. They don't have a digestive tract. Which is very uncommon in animals. So how do you think they get their food? They absorb it through the environment, okay? It's very similar to this guy here. Arrow worms, very small, only about 50 or 60 species. They're all marine and they're all planktonic. Remember what it means to be planktonic. You cannot swim against the current. So they're just going wherever the current takes them. And they're carnivores. So what do you think a small, little, almost transparent worm would be carnivorous of? Probably something that's also planktonic, like zooplankton, okay? But they're not herbivores, so they're not primary consumers eating phytoplankton, zooplankton, okay? Like copepods and larval forms of fish and crabs and things like that. Tiny, tiny stuff. All right, moving on to something that's a little higher up. These are called the Lophophorates, just like it's spelled, Lophophorates. They have a unique feeding structure called what? A lophophore, that's why they're called that. The lophophore is ciliated, looks like this, and they put it out and they just kind of clap it in the water and it captures organisms like zooplankton, phytoplankton, other small things, and it eats that way. So and that's called suspension feeding. They're not filter feeders like a sponge would be, and they're not detritivores chewing on, eating the dirt at the bottom or anything like that. They pretty much just hold up something and whatever comes by, they capture, and then they bring that in. That's suspension feeding. Create a feeding current, so they just go like this with them. Bryozoans are the first example of a lophophorate. They have delicate colonies on seaweed rocks and other surfaces. This is those, like I said, with some of the earlier organisms we talked about, hydrozoans, for example, and things. Everything down at the beach, or not the beach, but I guess it's a beach too if it's like a rock or something, but on the estuary side, definitely along the intracoastal here in Florida, everything in the water is pilings, rocks, they're all covered, docks, boats that are left in the water, they're all covered with some, like just a fuzzy layer. And that's, some of those things are these bryozoans. Almost all of them are marine. That means there are some that are freshwater. Colonies consist of small interconnected individuals called zooids that secrete skeletons of a variety of shapes. And so you can imagine these guys just all growing on all the different surfaces and just feeding with their lophophores. Phoronids, they're worm-like, but they're not worms. They build tubes of sand grains, like this one, okay? Phoroniopsis californica, Catalina Island in California, really nice place to go off the coast of California. Shallow water, most of them are very, very small. They have a nerve ring. They don't have a brain. That's their nervous system, just a ring, okay? And their mouth is their anus. Well, not quite, no, it's near their anus, not the same. And they have an intestine, so they have an intestinal tract, blood vessels, lamp shells. These guys have been around since before the dinosaurs, okay? This is a fossil lamp shell, brachiopod, they're called brachiopods. There are about 300 living species, but thousands of other species are fossil species. They have a shell with two parts, two valves, bivalve, but they're not quite in the bivalve class yet. We'll get to those next. They're lophophores, okay, because they feed with a lophophore. I'm going to show you the inside in a minute. So they attach to rocks or burrow into soft sediments in shallow water. And this is the inside. This is the lophophore right there, but I'm going to show you a diagram of that here. So they look like a clam, but they're not quite there yet. This is the pedicle. This is how they attach to a rock. It's like a ligament almost, okay? And you can see how complex they are. They have a gut, they have muscles, body cavity, the coelom, right? And then this lophophore feeding apparatus comes out of this gape and waves in the air and catches particles of organic matter and very small creatures that are floating by. And they'll pull it back in and eat it. All right, now we're moving up to the mollusca, phylum Mollusca. These are a huge phylum of organisms, both freshwater and saltwater, land and aquatic, but we're going to focus on the saltwater ones, right? 110,000 species that we know of so far, okay? Soft-bodied, protected by a hard shell, right? So one of the most common examples is your bivalve mollusk, okay? Like this clam. We'll talk more about what's going on here in a minute. All right. Sea slugs, octopi, snails, they all have something called a mantle. This is what all mollusks have in common. From the clam to the octopus, they all have a mantle. And it's a thin layer of tissue that either is their body itself, like the entire head of an octopus is the mantle. But the mantle in something like a clam actually secretes the shell. And I'm going to show you what that looks like. So here's just a generalized diagram so you can see how complex. It's almost looking like if you would have cut a mammal or a fish open, right? It's got all the things: kidney, heart, digestive gland, mouth, stomach, muscles, intestines, gills for gas exchange. And here's the mantle along the edge of the shell, so it would be right along the edge of both surfaces here, and it makes the shell. Actually, and this is a foot. I'm going to show you how that works in these organisms. Okay, so if you watch this animation, this is really cool. It's using its muscular foot to dig down and pull itself back into the sand. And it'll shoot, once it gets down low enough, it'll shoot out mud or water to do that. So they have gills, they have bilateral symmetry, so if you can cut it in half, and both halves will be very similar. Like, we have bilateral symmetry, almost exactly the same if you cut us down the middle, except our heart is a little bit over there, and our liver is a little bit over here. So, just a few internal differences, but mostly the same. And that foot is really cool. So they stick it into the sand, and then they contract it, which pulls the animal into the substrate, into the soil, and then they release it, and they keep doing that over and over again until it gets down, burrows into the sand, because that's where they want to be. Some mollusks have an anterior head, as opposed to posterior, the rear end, okay? And in that head is a ribbon of teeth, small chitinous teeth. Chitin is like what a crab's shell is made out of, crab's shell. We're not at crabs yet. That it uses to scrape off food like algae and stuff. It's called a radula. So this is what it looks like. It's made from chitin right there. It's made of similar to cellulose, which is what makes a plant stiff. Okay, so but it's not calcium carbonate like a shell like this. Okay, radula. Gastropods. This is gastropita, meaning stomach foot. Gastro meaning stomach, pod meaning foot. That means their stomach is like right on, their digestive system is like right on top of their muscular foot, right here. This is their muscular foot. So we're talking now about snails and slugs, the gastropods. Approximately 90,000 species of these. Some of them have shells, some don't. Slugs don't have shells, but snails do. And they use that radula to scrape algae from the rocks. Some of them are carnivores, eating clams and small fish. Like this guy right here has a little harpoon that will shoot out and paralyze. It's called a tulip snail, I think. And this is a giant keyhole limpet snail. Here are nutmeg snails. They suck the blood of electric rays. These snails are parasitic. Ever think you'd hear of a parasitic snail? That's pretty cool. There's also a parasitic bird, but we're not going to talk about that right now. So here's a nutmeg snail sucking the blood of a stingray's fin. Pretty wild. And so this is just the general anatomy, internal, external. Many of them are hermaphroditic, which means they have both sexes, okay? Penis, vagina, okay? And digestive gland, lungs. This is a land snail, of course, if it has lung. Gills, if it's a sea snail. But this is just a general. And the mantle excretes the shell, makes the shell. All right, what is a nudibranch? A nudibranch is essentially a sea slug, and they don't have shells. And they crawl around and prey on sponges, hydroids, and other invertebrates. They're poisonous because they personally, individually, are not creating poison, but they can ingest the poison of the things that they eat and keep it for themselves to become poisonous. That's pretty wild, okay? So they retain those noxious chemicals even from nematocysts when they're feeding on something that's a cnidarian, like a sponge or something, not a sponge, wow, a coral, okay? And where the toxins get stored are in these serrata. They're a part of the digestive system that goes up into these extensions, and that stores the toxins from the nematocysts that it eats. So if something comes by and wants to feed upon this guy, it's going to go chomp and say, oh, I don't like the taste of that, blah, blah, blah. And it's going to swim away, and then this guy will just keep on going and living. And some of them are quite beautiful. They're amazing. And now we're moving on to the bivalve mollusks, class Bivalvia. So we're kingdom Animalia, phylum Mollusca, class Bivalvia. Okay? And these are your clams, mussels, oysters, etc. Body laterally compressed, like I showed you with the clamshell before. And 2 valves. The shells are called valves. So a bivalve, you know what that means, 2 shells. Okay? They have gills. We talked about that already. And they also, they're filter feeders, these guys. So they have these siphons that come out and pull in water, filter the water through their gills, and then X-current valve that blows the water back out again. And the body lies again within that mantle cavity, which secretes the shell. So clams are the first example. These are the ones that have the very strong foot that burrows into the substrate, the sand or mud. Again, the in-current and X-current siphon is how they bring water in that has particles, food, and then the expelled and wastes also out of the X-current. Some of them have very long, so this is the top of the mud, and they're down in the mud, and they put their siphon all the way out to pull in water. They essentially clean the water. They really do. You could put a bunch of clams or oysters or mussels in some like dirty intracoastal water, and after a few hours, the water will be crystal clear. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. That's why when you're buying these or clamming for these, fishing for these, you need to make sure that they are come from clean water. Because if they come from polluted water, they're pulling all the pollutants into their bodies, and you can get sick from eating bad shellfish. That's why all these oyster bars that, raw bar that sell raw oysters, I would not cook an oyster unless it was, eat an oyster unless it was cooked. Otherwise you're gonna be cooked. Okay, so, and this is inside of a mussel. Mussels secrete these strong byssal threads that are proteinaceous, almost like a spider web, but even stronger, I think. Because if you ever try to pull a mussel off of its rock, it's extremely hard to get off because it's holding on with these byssal threads. And they're very similar to clams, except they don't dig down into the substrate. Oysters have cement. So clams use a muscular foot to get down into the substrate. Mussels use byssal threads to connect to rocks and hard substrates, and oysters use biological cement. Like pretty much part of their shell, calcium carbonate, they grow onto where they're growing. When they settle down, then they start excreting that cement. These are the only ones that can produce pearls. They have to have some sort of irritating particle like sand or something that got in under their mantle, between their mantle and their shell, and they will secrete something called mother of pearl. That's that shiny iridescent material that's part of the calcium carbonate, part of the shell. Shiny layers of calcium carbonate. Scallops are really cool. Scallops are dear to my heart because when I served on a NOAA vessel, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration vessel, years ago, we studied these guys, and here's a shell from a sea scallop. So if you've ever eaten sea scallops at a restaurant, this is what they look like. And the muscle that you eat is attached right here, and that's the adductor muscle. That's what keeps the scallop closed, but it also helps them They can swim. These guys can get away from a predator by using jet propulsion. It's really cool. And they have these little pseudo eyes that can sense light on the edge of their mantle. So they are neat organisms. This is just showing how they have many compound eyes. Each eye has a system like this. It's quite complex. They have retinas with rods, pigment reflecting membranes, optic nerve. So the most advanced eye so far of any creature we've talked about. In a scallop like this, these guys, sea scallops. While on that NOAA at Sea program, I was a scientist, and that's me about 20 years ago, 21 years ago, on this vessel here. And I served on that vessel for a while, and we had to study sea scallops like this. So we determined what the sexes were. The females had bright red, and the males had white sex gonad tissue. So we had to record that information. We determined that there were some symbiotic relationships going on. This is called a Lipurus fish. It lives inside the tissues of the sea scallop. It's pretty cool. Then there's another called a hake, a red hake. When they're young, they will live inside. Here's the mussel that you eat. So this is the shell right here. Not that exact shell, but you could see how that shell fits this scenario. So that's the mussel that you eat. And this is the baby red hake that stays there for a short part of its time and then moves on. And that's the red hake, the fish, the adductor mussel. Okay. Now moving on to shipworms. Shipworms are not worms at all. You would think that they were, right? They are only worms in resemblance. They're mollusks. They're like they have a shell, see? And then they have this long body that extends out, and they will use their shell to chew through wood like this. And they were called shipworms because people back in the day didn't know that they weren't worms, and they destroyed ships. If a ship was in the water too long, they were going to get infected with these shipworms. They cut the wood. They use their valves to cut tunnels through the wood. And then they'll line the tunnel with calcium carbonate. They are a fouling organism. Any organism that grows on man-made objects like boats, docks, pilings, intakes to factories and such, they will grow all in there and foul it up, mess it up. Fouling organisms. And now we're at the cephalopods, the last portion of our notes. Class Cephalopoda. Cephal means head, pod means foot, head foot. So these organisms literally have their feet or arms coming out of their head. Okay? They're predators, specialized for locomotion. Many of them existed hundreds of millions of years ago, way before the dinosaurs. And these are examples of an artist's rendition and examples of some that lived a long time ago. We're talking about the octopi, the squids, the cuttlefish, the nautilus, about 650 species, and they're all marine. There are no freshwater cephalopods. Again, their head has arms coming out of it, and the arms have suckers, typically, like an octopus. These are the suckers of the giant Pacific octopus. And some squid suckers actually have hooks on them. That's why you will see sperm whales that feed on the giant squid exclusively with scars all over their heads from battling these giant squid down in the depths a mile down. Eyes are very similar to humans. So now we're talking about really advanced creature here. Octopi actually are some of the smartest creatures in the world. Why people eat these organisms is totally beyond me. You should not eat an octopus. These are, I think, as close to a sentient invertebrate. Sentient meaning extremely intelligent invertebrate without bones, right? In the world, that we know of that exists. So very complex. They will find homes anywhere, food, in places that you wouldn't think they could get to, okay? They have 2 or 4 gills with water exiting through a funnel, okay? And that's how they use that jet propulsion. So here's the funnel shooting the water out, bringing the water in here and out there, okay? Mating requires the male to deposit something called a spermatophore, or an elongated packet of sperm, into the female's mantle cavity. And they will do this with a special arm. Here are blue-ringed octopus, the only venomous octopus in the world. They live in the Great Barrier Reef. Their arm is called a hectocotylus, and it transfers the sperm to the female. So the octopus is the first one we're going to talk about. They don't have a shell, 8 arms, hence octa, okay? They're benthic, bottom. They live on the bottom. There are no pelagic. Pelagic is in the water column above. So you're not going to find an octopus typically swimming in the water with the other fish. It's on the bottom. And they range from very tiny, 5 centimeters, to 9 meters. That's like the whole diagonal width of this classroom. Giant Pacific octopus. They're predators, eating crabs, lobsters, shrimp. They have beak-like jaws. Chomp, chomp. Some of them, like I said, the blue-ringed octopus, have a highly toxic bite. This is a bite marks on a crab leg. They love crabs. They love to eat crustaceans. They make shelter in rocks, and they emit a dark fluid from an ink sac. So here's one with the ink sac shooting it. He's trying to get away and confuse the diver here, but in natural situation, it would be a predator, or a fish or something, trying to get them. Squids are adapted for fast swimming. They can swim much faster than any of the cephalopods. They have 10 arms, not 8. That's why they're not an octopus. They have 2 extra arms that they can feed with. They shoot them out. On the end, they're called clubs, and they shoot them out to capture prey. Shot out forward to catch prey. They have a supportive, flimsy shell called a pen. So this is the only one that has this pen shell. It looks like a piece of plastic. If you've ever gotten squid from the fish market and cleaned them, you have to remove the pen shell before you cook it. And it's inside there. Very reduced in size shell, just to give their mantle a little support. Otherwise it would be too flimsy. Range from just a few centimeters to the giant Architeuthis, largest living invertebrate, the giant squid. Here's one that's in a lab that was preserved. Very rare to find. Sometimes they'll wash up on shore. This was a pretty neat video that a Japanese fishing vessel got of one near the surface. You can see he's probably not doing too well. It's probably why he's near the surface. He's probably dying. But here's an artist's rendition of, and there are new videos out since I made this PowerPoint of sperm whale chewing on a giant squid near the surface. They got some new video since this. If you looked up sperm whale fighting squid, you can probably find them on YouTube. So here's another one. And they have beaks, this big beak. The size of that beak, it's as big as your hand, right? And we know that the sperm whales, before we even had video, we knew that they fed on these squids because we find the beaks in the washed up beach whales' stomachs, undigestible, because they're made out of chitin, like the shells of a crab, and they can't digest those. Strange deep sea squid with long tentacles, okay? Unlike squids that live near the surface, these critters don't seem to move about by squirting water. They just go with the current down at the bottom. Really wild looking things. Look like they're from a different planet. Cuttlefish, amazing hunters, amazing display of chromatophores in their skin that change color based upon if they're trying to hide or their emotions. They will change color based upon their emotions. So right now he's getting ready to attack some food, and that's his like attack mode. So first he's camouflage, and then it's just, they're called chromatophores, okay? And they have this internal shell. If you have birds like parrots, you probably are familiar with a cuttlebone shell. It's an internal shell for buoyancy that they use in their mantle here. You can see it's very similar to the shape of their mantle, cuttlebone. And then finally we have the chambered nautilus, the little nautilus, cute little guy here. They have air spaces inside in their shell to keep them buoyant. They have 60 to 90, a lot of small tentacles at their mouth, suckerless to capture prey. So these are also very ancient, the chambered nautilus. And that's our notes.